Rebecca, thank you very much. And then to everybody in attendance, please do accept that we really appreciate the effort that you have made to be here with us today. As Rebecca has indicated, I joined the Liquor Authority last year after having spent like 10 months at the Liquor Authority in 2019. There has been, and maybe we should start with that, some engagement with you previously, and I acknowledge that that has taken place. I think since the lockdown that may have fallen by the wayside, and I think attempts to have that online were made. I can't tell you to what extent that has been successful, but by and large, we haven't had this kind of engagement. So I think the first and the basis for our engagement this morning is to set a platform in place that is going to allow that happening going forward. So I want you to approach this as setting the scene for what is to happen going forward. I'll have to look along the side. So if I can go to the first slide, please. Oh yeah, sorry. It's my job. So maybe just to say that, Mr. Conrea reminded me now that we squeezed the session in just before the end of the financial year, our financial year. It's a commitment that we've made previously, and we've also given this commitment to our custodial department and to the Western Cape government that we will have such an engagement. We see this as a critical development of us enhancing our ability to effectively regulate and to respond to the needs of the applicants and also their representatives, of course. So understanding then, that having been said, this will now happen on 4 scheduled sessions going forward. I must apologize. I was hoping to get out the terms of reference before this particular engagement. However, due to the substantial changes that we've brought about to what was previously submitted, that has to be consulted internally, and that can only happen in the course of next week, I think, when our management meeting happens, and after that we'll distribute it. At the very least, I must ensure that I have internal buy-in for that process before we actually communicate that externally. So I can tell you broadly, by and large, what it outlines and what it wants to achieve, and maybe I shall start with that. So colleagues, the first point I want to make, and the reason for this slide, is essentially to state that I think it's very important for all of us in this particular space to have a consensus as why we regulate. Because if you fail to understand that, you will always approach regulation in a manner that you wish to oppose it or seem to be opposing. Likewise, in terms of our efforts to regulate, we need to be conversant with the challenges that applicants experience in relation to our manner of regulating. And I think that is very, very important. So first and foremost, we need to recognize that we have 3 spheres of government, and each of those spheres of government have regulatory competencies, or shall I say legislative competence, in relation to the sale of alcohol. That being said, I think what we accept by and large as government, any formation of government, and by extension, any entity or department of government must demonstrate its value in relation to the good or the public good. So with that being said, I think there's a need for us to understand without regulation, and this is not only about the alcohol, it can be with anything, whether you can cross a street at a particular time or the like. The need for that is an orderly arrangement and a compact between citizens and the government they allow to exist. Because ultimately that is, if you cut down to everything and the government is allowed to exist. So a lot of what we speak, and when people speak about you get the government you deserve, essentially that is, in terms of the historical arrangements around why government happens, that is what is meant by that. The other reality that we have to understand, and why public good is considered, and why we have recognition of liquor as a substance capable of regulation, is simply, and it's generally stated, a psychoactive substance with intoxicating and dependence-producing properties. With that having been said, that does not mean that with an absolute embargo or an absolute refusal around liquor and the trading in liquor. I think there are choices being made, and once that choice is exercised, you are accepting that you are trading in a substance that is capable of doing this, or with this particular outcome. And I think that is a very important thing we'd like to register right from the outset. So increasingly government, and what you notice is government needs to respond to the needs of citizens. So essentially, in the same way that you are here representing other citizens that are wanting to have an economic activity that allows them a means of income. In the same way, those that are basically functioning in that space and live with the consequences have the same needs to be respected in terms of their voices. I think this is just something that we'd like to register. So whenever you hear people or citizen-centric approaches to that, it's a recognition that we have to be, as a government, responsive to those needs. And then also here we need to understand that while we are the liquor authority, we are just one aspect, arm, or entity in relation to what ultimately is the regulation of our society. All state systems and processes must be aligned to enable an effective and efficient regulation. So we're not only speaking about an effective or impactful, but also an efficient process of doing that. So we commit ourselves to that as well. So thank you very much. I lost control. Okay. So maybe just now at this point to register the purpose of this engagement and why we deem it appropriate for us to pursue this going forward. So why do we have a liquor consultants forum, or why would we like to have this formulated? We'd like to provide consultants with access to the Western Cape Liquor Authority on transversal matters that impact on the expeditious processing of applications as provided for in terms of the Act. I think that is an important thing we'd like to register. Secondly, also very importantly, is we need to be responsible and accountable for the process that we oversee. So the Western Cape Liquor Authority is opening itself up in terms of the administrative aspects, but also in terms of the LLT and the appeal tribunal. So this must be articulated right at the beginning. We would like this forum to hold us accountable equally in relation to what we are doing. Now, I think in the past, we may have been a little in relation to, this is my process, I manage it, I will do it as it is. If you communicated that, I can assure you, we wish to project a public or a servant perspective to what needs to happen and how we want to do that. And in relation to government, this is not applicable only to the entity, which is the Western Cape Liquor Authority, but I think it generally applies to all institutions of government, whether it be at local level, provincial level, or national level. A measure of humility needs to enter in terms of how we respond to the citizens of the Western Cape and for the West and for South Africa generally. Also, we'd like to enable input and comments in respect of our systems and processes of the Western Cape Liquor. It would be foolish of us to accept that what we introduce is the best possible way. We have to understand your experience with the Western Cape Liquor Authority. We need to understand the public's experience in relation to the Western Cape Liquor Authority. If you don't understand that, how do you understand the challenge that we have? How do we become fit to do what we ought to be doing if we do not understand the problem statement around our existence? But more importantly, how are we going to achieve what we want to achieve if we do not understand what presents the challenge to those objectives? So our objectives, if you understand it, hopefully you can align to it. I'm not necessarily saying you'll be convinced that it is your objective, or you'll be convinced that it is the best way to achieve it. But at the very least, we would like you to understand that having considered all these aspects, we're taking accountability for what we decide on going forward and the process that we follow. And I think that essentially is what we want to register here as well. All the initiatives and interventions that we embark upon, first instance, we'd like to, make you aware of that, obtain and achieve an input and comments in relation to that, and then ultimately, in terms of its implementation, you're understanding how we are doing that. So you understand our behavior or what we are doing within the context of what you understand we want to do. And I think then you will be able to hold us accountable to that and maybe remind us as to those systems and those processes. And then I think key to this, and which is possibly a messaging that we have not articulated well enough in the past, we have to develop a consensus around the value of regulation. Because if your experience of regulation is one that is just absolute frustrating, and just by that it's very virtual, then there are 2 or 3 reasons that could be at play. One, you can be what is called an nihilist, which means everything that we do, we can take care of ourselves, and society doesn't need structure. Or you can have the approach that in relation to this, we can be better at ensuring the outcomes that need to exist. And that secondly, if you participate in that process and suggest how things could be happening better, then we will, based on our anticipation of that and bringing it on board, be more responsive to what you, as the representatives of the applicants, are wanting to experience. So it's very important for that, so that when you engage the liquor authority, we'd like to be at the point where you understand the existence of the Western Cape Liquor Authority as serving not only your own interests, but the interests of society at large. And that the outcome or the process is something that you can be proud of as a South African first and foremost. That is, you'd like to say, it's like going through a roadblock. Now you can approach a roadblock from 2 ways. One, you can look at it and say, this is a waste of time. I'm late. I want to be there. I can be there. Or you can approach it from, there are people that are actually taking care of our society. There are people that are regulating our spaces. There are people that are looking out for the well-being of the citizens. And this is where we want to be. We want to be in the space where we are getting to the objectives that clearly, and the potential harms that can be presented by the substance that we trade in, but to do so in a manner that we're actually having the required impact. Our challenge is not the actual decision, it's actually the process in terms of getting to that decision. And as far as the actual decision and the merits of the decision is concerned, as the administration, I can assure you, our interest does not primarily lie there, other than that the outcome is a fair, just, and equitable one. And I think it's very important for me to make that statement. We have very particular people tasked with that responsibility, and that ultimately their interpretation of how that must be happening is theirs, and as an administrator, I'm not at liberty to direct what that is. I'm not at liberty, otherwise I'll be failing also and acting beyond my jurisdiction, so to speak, and my powers. So essentially, people and colleagues, I want to make that point very clear. If something interpretively, we can dispute in relation to what it amounts to, but the processes there are available and that must be explored. But granted, I do not think that we should be scant in considering requests in a particular way, because ultimately, so much the cost implications of all of that can be considerable. So it is necessary for us to interpret things in a way that enables regulation. And I think that is how we'd like to be approaching this. Then we and then the same applies to, I think, the last 2 bullets there. There's a need for us to demonstrate that the information that you hold, whether it's coming from you as the consultants and representatives, or whether it's coming from us in terms of the data that is generated, and maybe increasingly one should communicate that both ways, because it's also important for you to understand generally within the context of your applications, those that you facilitate, how does that relate to the total outcome in terms of trends and developments going forward. And then we'd like to promote improved regulatory compliance. So essentially then what ultimately happens, if you believe regulation is, you are mindful of the process that you are following, then you'd understand then that we are capable of ensuring that the resources of the Western Cape Liquor Authority actually goes to where it is needed. And that's the way you keep the cost of regulation down going forward. So I think that's also an important thing we like to register. Just allow me to get water. Okay, so messaging our mandate. I think you would all more or less know what that is. And also please note that we will be spending considerable effort going, and we have over the last few years at the website, but considerable more things will be happening there as well going forward. So increasingly all relevant documentation, the narratives around what we are doing are available on the website. So it's important for us to understand that our communication vehicle will increasingly also be accessible via the website, especially when we're looking at the online application process going forward. So we will not necessarily, I won't dwell on this other than to say that when we facilitate licensing and regulatory processes in the public interest, we have to do so optimizing the resources we have. And I've made that point now in terms of ensuring that the cost thereof is always in relation to the impact, which means we can then concentrate and prioritize the other things if we get more compliance happening going forward. And also, maybe just to indicate, ultimately, although many will think that the granting of the license and the application of the license itself is everything, colleagues, what I'd like you to remind you, it's actually about the existence of the license on an ongoing basis. So while at the application process, you are required to demonstrate, let's assume all the documentation is on order, everything is submitted, and the application meets, or the concerns are accommodated by virtue of the conditions, please bear in mind that the conditions are cardinal in terms of the application. Because the condition is the one, if applied, is then giving the assurance to those who may have had objection to it in the first instance. And if we understand that regulatory relationship, then we'll come to grips with a reality then that public interest is an ongoing interest that needs to be served. And our responsibility as the Western Cape Liquor Authority is to ensure that it's not a winner-takes-all situation that arises with the application itself. It's a system of regulation that speaks to the ongoing behavior in relation to the license that has been granted. So that regulatory relationship exists from the day you apply to the day that license no longer exists. And we all know that what can then terminate the relationship as far as the license is concerned. And I think the role of the consultants in this regard is to start messaging that to applicants beyond the actual license. So if you're going to have a relationship with a licensee, is actually indicating the complex nature of the relationship, but also ensuring then that that relationship is maintained because it makes good business sense. And this is where we'd like to be, the space that we'd like to be. We do not want to target people or seem to be targeting individuals that are actually, they focused in terms of existing within that framework. We must start respecting that. There may be mishaps here and there, but we must see how we can resolve that in terms of us moving forward. Okay? And then ultimately getting to the point that less resources go to that because there's just more compliant behavior. And I think that messaging is also then coming from the consultants in relation to the license holders. I think that will register and makes this entire process one that we can basically be proud of, and then we can justify at all levels. And I think this is ultimately what needs to be appreciated by all of us. Our execution of this is then going to compel an appreciation for regulation, how we conduct ourselves in relation to that. I do not believe I want to head an organization or an institution that is here to catch you out. That's not why we are here. We are actually here to ensure that the license that we get to granted are actually operated mindful of the communities that we serve, mindful of the spaces that we are occupying. And I think if we have that understanding, then I think we will immediately develop a lot of synergies and find greater appreciation of each other in that process. I must, however, admit that based on the number of things that cross my table on a daily basis, there are a lot of things that we need to attend to as the Western Cape Liquor Authority. And that is simply because, and the number of things that we are doing in response thereto, and which will become apparent, is then, I think, some of the things that we'd like to communicate. Now, on the offset, I can tell you the following. I do not understand to what extent we are able to secure a file when you are allowed to communicate with a number of people in the organization. It is something that I think as an authority is one of the things that we'd like to see happening as soon as possible. I would want the kind of certainty that a request for documentation, if received, there's an official record of that in that it relates to the Western Cape Liquor Authority receiving it. Secondly, that we develop service of standards of service delivery in relation to each and every connection you make with the Western Cape Liquor Authority. Now, it's not going to be easy, that I can tell you, I can assure you, but we're in the process of developing exactly that. So you will find that there will be some presentations that will speak to how that is enabled with the online application process, but ultimately we are mindful that a lot of the frustration can be avoided if our communication is one that is precise, it is worthy of scrutiny, it has a legitimacy in terms of the record, and it reflects whatever is on that particular record. Unfortunately, a number of things land somewhere in the building, and it's not in relation to where the response or the work had to be coming. So be mindful that in relation to this will be changing hopefully very, very shortly, in that we will be creating that. But also can I remind you that I think when that familiarity develops and you participate in it, you must also bear in mind that you are furthering that chaos, so to speak, that we'd like to escape. If you are mindful that, if we, first of all, we accept that. If you feel you can work with certain people in the building and they will deliver the thing, then that is my problem. Because you don't need to worry about who you're connecting to. If you make a connection with the Western Cape Liquor Authority, that you ought to be enough. And this is the situation where we'd like to be sooner rather than later. The same would apply on a number of levels that we've spoken to, whether the payments connect to the applications and things like that. A number of things have happened in that space. So you find whether a payment was made at 12 o'clock on the 31st, or whether it came through on the 1st, or whatever that may case. Those are things we are mindful of and things that we'd like to give a commitment to addressing going forward. So in relation to that, I'm now went off the presentation. And I know it's a measure of discomfort for us, but I'm not going to hide behind the fact that we can be better at what we do. That is the first thing I would concede right now. What is the preamble to our Constitution? We are required to develop a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental rights. I think we all know that, especially if you've if the Constitution, it's one of the things that reads like so easy. I mean, it's an amazing Constitution. So essentially, I would think we must just remain minded as to why we do this. There's a vision alignment, I think, with the Western Cape government's vision. I won't go into that either. Suffice to say that I think what we do recognize is that we have a harms reduction white paper in the Western Cape that is applicable to us. And for our purposes, that is determining the public interest. Now, we've had an interesting discussion around, and I know a number of you have, especially when you're legally trained, Mr. Cornier, if I can just touch on some of the conversations we've had in relation to what extent you enable communities or an expression of community, and whether it's a determination in law or whether it's a factual determination of what the public interest is. Those are very interesting discussions, of course, but we've had over the last few months looked at that and come to realize that there are certain things that are very clear around the changes to the Act of recent years. One, we have a particular board member that is tasked with alcohol harms reduction, basically being they've existed and functioned in that particular space. Secondly, we have a clear indication that the Liquor Licensing Tribunal has to reflect or consider it within the context of public interest. Ascertaining what that exactly means, of course, is their particular challenge. Then the third thing, I think, which is, I suppose, part of the frustration of a number of the representatives, or shall I say consultants, is the representation on the LLT then takes into account our communities and representatives of communities. Mindful, however, that the presiding officers and the deputy presiding officers remain legally qualified individuals. The point of me mentioning this is actually, no matter how I feel around certain things, the reality of it simply is that public interest and the expression of public interest, you have to internalize that in relation to your each and every application submitted. What that ought to be may not necessarily where we are in our own positions, but essentially you have to understand that your arguments will have to go around with that, and that ultimately it could possibly well be that you have to negotiate with communities to demonstrate why it would be appropriate to have that license. Now, we have many instances where we will accept an argument that I think, maybe I shouldn't speak on the LLT's behalf, but a cogent argument, but also it's in the white paper, can be made that the legalization of an illegal outlet could very much be in the public interest. And let me demonstrate that. So you have an outlet operating on the basis that the community supports it, but you have community activists that do not want to see that outlet. But what is the regulator expected to do? The regulator can't control the demand. The regulator is in a position to control access, but the availability of that liquor. Now, taking that in mind, understand what it is we can do, and we have to get communities then to understand that it may be in their public interest to ask or support an application that could result in a licensed outlet, because there are 20 unlicensed ones, which they support. And they exist because there's a demand for it. So essentially, communities will then, if they're asking for us to prohibit licensing in that space, the argument can very well be made that if you have control over them and regulate them, you probably have a better outcome than an unregulated one. And I think, and everybody wants to be lawful or legal for that matter. So colleagues, what I'm trying to suggest here is that although, public interest could have a particular definition, it could very well go either way as far as that is concerned. So be mindful of that, and as representatives, I think we need to articulate that, because ultimately on a balance of probabilities, you will have to be required one to show that. And if there's any doubt, of course, I don't think the LLT has much option as far as to which way. If they have doubt, then, I mean, as a presiding officer at one particular point in time, you're entitled then to deny an application. So it's incumbent on representatives to understand this and internalize it. Okay, so then basically, let me just say I've covered everything there. Enforcement, maybe just let me, if you'll allow me to speak to that aspect. Two I've spoken to. So enforcement is an integral part of the comprehensive approach to effective regulation. You may have, you may understand that, simply because if you're looking at policing, we want more visibility and the like. But I think the thing very critical for us around enforcement is that it provides data and information pertaining to the licensed premises. And furthermore, it allows us to access these licensed premises much more regularly. So we have multiplied capacity in that regard threefold. The outcome thereof is simply that we're now in a much better position to be able to tell you the number of compliant outlets out there. Education and awareness, I wouldn't go into detail there. Information and data collection, also very important. Increasingly, we have to utilize the information that we have to better regulate. Okay, so there we have the LLA, which is basically the administration process in terms of the applications received. That's the purpose, but what I want to jump to is the outcome. We want improved service delivery that enhances compliance by license holders. We also want an appreciation for the value and the benefit of regulation, meaning the compliance aspects of all the documentation in relation thereto. And that will ultimately impact as far as effective regulation, reducing alcohol-related harms. The second is, of course, the Liquor License Tribunal, which is to adjudicate all liquor license applications and enforcement processes in a manner that serves the public interest. Of course, the outcomes we want to achieve there is facilitate the entrance of responsible license holders with appreciation for regulation, and we'd like stakeholder appreciation for the value of regulation, and we want greater compliance, of course. So it's almost like indicating that if you are well as far as your enforcement and compliance is concerned, then you would have less problems, and of course it's good business sense happening there. Then the compliance and enforcement is basically to support the LLT in its determination of public interest in relation to any aspect, whether it be the application, whether it be the renewal of that license in instances where they are compelled to apply for renewal, or whether it is in relation to compliance on an ongoing basis subject to complaints and the following. What is the outcome we want there? Is basically an increased level of compliance. And the impact would then be an effective regulation towards alcohol-related harms. Then you have the communication, education, and stakeholder relations, which then essentially would be taking care of this engagement on a quarterly basis, but also the processing of the request, information, and the data. So the determination of the agenda would then be processed over the 3 months prior to their next engagement, and then facilitating this particular engagement in a way that we can assess whether since the last engagement we've improved, and going forward what we will focus on towards the next engagement. So here you'll find is championing and understanding and appreciation for the value of regulation, and what we'd like to see here is increased community participation in the application and complaints processes. So bear in mind that this needs to be facilitated at some point using the structures available to government, so that we actually do understand what those public interest concerns are, and then that is towards a reduction in harms. Can I just add at this point that not solely is it about the application itself, but it's also about what they would deem appropriate in terms of how that license is operated. So that engagement with communities is then understanding that to what extent can the trade or the in liquor, under those circumstances, satisfy them as far as their needs are concerned. So if you have rowdiness coming from an establishment, as an example, the solution could very well be that the outlet would become much more stricter, provide for security, and then would not serve people that are visibly intoxicated. That could be an obvious, but we also know that the more liquor you sell, the more your profit. So ultimately, what are you prepared to sacrifice? Are you prepared to sacrifice the source of your revenue and income? Or rather benefit from a sustainable business practice? And I think that is ultimately the choice that we want to leave the license holder with. And then opportunities going forward, I think there's a need for us to be a much more effective and a capable Western Cape Liquor Authority, appropriately structured and resourced for greater impact. I think that is an opportunity that exists. We have clear strategies towards this. We believe the need for us to be a fit for purpose structure, responsive to the regulatory needs of the Western Cape. We also need to modernize our systems. Despite all of the things that we have been able to do up until now, the modernization now needs to translate to real value for applicants, but also real value to the process to expedite decision making. I think that is ultimately where we want to be, but also to get a process where complaints or concerns around the license is expedited in the shortest possible period. And then the other is, of course, recovering the cost of regulation on a differentiated basis. Now, what does that essentially mean? I don't think if you're compliant, would you like to be contributing to regulation in the same way that a non-compliant outlet is doing. So what we have to compound, right, is a distinction with those that are errant. So we get those that are errant to pay slightly more because the cost of doing business as the Western Cape Liquor Authority needs to be carried by somebody, because that is an additional cost, of course. And we can't expect that somebody who's paid a license fee compliant, remains compliant, that they then also subsidize, so to speak, those that are errant. And I think this is the space that we'd like to be within. And we'd like to also develop a mutually beneficial regulatory relationship with liquor consultants. Please accept our commitment to this. We also like to explore synergy with related systems and processes. As we've indicated, there are a number of systems and processes run by other departments. To what extent can we piggyback on that? I've visited let's say the city of Cape Town when I was visited in 2019, and I was amazed at the possibility of aligning some of their processes to ours, because they replicate, it would appear, some of the things that we already do. And if they're going to do it, then we don't have to do it. If we're doing, they don't have to do it. So I think we would like to approach that as well going forward. And then how, as a Western Cape Liquor Authority, do we anticipate, participate, and lead regulation? Now, I've been able to attend some of these platforms at a national basis. I think there's a need for us to develop similar programs with other provinces. Our systems, of course, our jurisprudence, of course, allows each province to develop its own regulatory space in each of the provinces. But I think the benefit of aligning that more and more would I think, make the facilitation of the process so much better, especially when you're looking at the multinationals as an example. If we can develop synergies as far as that is concerned. Furthermore, if we want to be able to focus and our attention to those priorities, then we need to understand flows and trends in relation to the availability of alcohol, liquor, the volumes being sold, and so forth going forward. So we are keen to do exactly that in this particular space. So colleagues, in conclusion, yeah, I think I'm fairly okay for time. I must have done really well. Okay, no, is my time finished? Okay. So let me conclude with the following. As public body, the entity, it exists to create public value. Colleagues, we have to take that seriously. And bear in mind that we commit to them. Also, I'd like to quote the following. You are free to choose, but you are not free from the consequence of choice. So ultimately, the world that we live in is the world that we allow for ourselves. And we can't divorce the little decisions or the little systemic issues that we think are inconsequential. And we can't escape that these things have consequences. All right? And I think that's an important comment I'd like to make there. And then we're also very keen to eliminate the complexity that enabling a citizen-centric regulatory methodology and practices. We'd like to make the process as simple as possible. We look at ourselves within the regulatory space and say that actually we must get to the point where our footprint actually becomes smaller. Why? Because there's less of a challenge. So I'm mindful I can't actually extrapolate the thinking to the consultants, because ultimately, if we simplify the process, what does that mean, essentially? So I'd like to think that consultants, no matter unlike lawyers, will always have jobs. In the same way that we, that are prepared to look at the alternatives, will always have jobs in relation to us doing less in this space, but more in another space. So essentially, we're looking at ourselves as how do you make ourselves redundant. So it's a weird concept in terms of business process, but actually, you will never be out of a job if you're always looking at ways to expand the impact and the footprint, because there's something else that needs to be done. And I think that's where we would like to be. And then I'd like to conclude with the following. Essentially, we want the same thing. I'd like to think that ultimately, as we said here, we want the same thing. A societal system that works, not necessarily giving us what we want each time. But you would know that there's a system you go to, there's a system that would be processed, there would be an administrative process that is fair, just, and equitable. We have to live with that produces for us now. So colleagues, I'll conclude with that, and I'll accommodate the questions and interaction session later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simeon. I'd like to invite Letitia Peterson up, the head of the Liquor Licensing Administration.
Good morning, everyone. I must say I'm very excited to be speaking about the next topic, which, as the CEO has already alluded to, first introduction. Letitia Peterson, I'm the head of the Liquor Licensing Administration component of the WCLA, and as such, I'm also quite actively involved with the online client services platform that the WCLA envisages to roll out in the coming months. Much has already been said now about eliminating complexities and also modernizing our systems. And hopefully by speaking a bit more and bringing a bit more to the fore about us enhancing our accessibility of the WCLA through this envisaged platform that will relate to something that I think that would be of benefit and of value add to many of our stakeholders, as well as to the applicants and the license holders as well. So if I can just kick off with the background as to where we started off with this concept, or with this project that we have embarked upon. So if we look at the provincial strategic plan for the years 2019 to 2024, and this was launched by the Premier in March 2020. This is basically the guiding document for growth and development of the province, and it also forms the backbone of many of our strategic objectives and many of the plans that we also envisage to roll out in the future. Sorry, but yeah, basically to speak to that document, there was 5, in terms of that document and also the Western Cape Government Safety Plan, there are basically 5 VIPs in terms of this document. So if we can just go through them. The first one is safe and cohesive communities. The second one is growth and jobs. Third one is empowering people. Fourth is mobility and spatial transformation. And lastly, innovation and culture. So now if we look at innovation and culture, we are looking at utilizing various technological enhancements and looking at, as we've said before, modernization of our systems and our processes to enable us to be able to speak directly to that value add. I think the CEO has also spoken about us adopting a more citizen-centric approach. So if we look at becoming citizen-centric, we asked ourselves exactly how do we bring that about? And how do we become more responsive to the needs of basically the applicants and the license holders whom we serve, and making our services also more accessible. So once we started asking those questions, the answers to those questions started coming more easily, and we started thinking, as they proverbially say, out of the box, and we started thinking of more user-friendly ways also of making the WCLA, the services of the WCLA, more accessible to the public. So if you think of the services of the WCLA, we think about lodgement, but that is not necessarily the only thing that the WCLA offers in terms of a service. So this platform, which I will speak a bit more about now, is basically to make accessible this wide spectrum of services that we offer. For example, lodging comments to an application, which is something that you then physically have to do in a hard copy form, whereas basically if you think more innovatively, there's other ways of doing it as well. And especially thinking of the time period that we came from now, which is a hard lockdown. Oh. Okay, just give me an indication. Sorry everyone, I think we're just having some technical difficulties with our Microsoft Teams link. Some of our participants who are joining us virtually is not able to hear us and to see us, so we're just giving some time to the technical team just to fix that. Apologies.
Apologies, everyone, for the disruption to the flow, but I know that there are about 20 people on the Teams meeting who are really missing out now with the details, so we're just trying to get it back on. If it doesn't get sorted in the next 30 seconds or so, then we'll continue, and there is a recording that we will be able to share with those who are attending virtually. So apologies, Letitia. Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
Okay. If we look at the purpose of this process that we are embarking upon, it's basically that our focus over the next 5 financial years, which is part of our 5-year strategic planning period, it would be to continue to modernize our systems and our processes. As I've said now, it's going to be a useless exercise for us just to look at our internal processes and not to have our systems that support those processes align as well. So we're looking at both systems and as well as our processes in alignment to enable a more efficient form of service delivery to our stakeholders. So basically what we are doing is we're focusing our efforts on streamlining systems, adopting new technologies and business models, and also aligning our services and our processes to regulate liquor and the harms that is related to that. When we looked at what it is that the problem that we are faced with, or what our problem statement basically would be if we were to think in terms of, myself being legally inclined, I normally think of what is my legal question. So if you look at what is your legal question and what is it that you need to address, it would basically be that there is currently a need for us to provide the citizen with an easy and a convenient channel to apply for and to track the progress of the application, as well as to obtain a liquor license and to access all services. So if we're looking at currently, if, for example, somebody who is living in a far outlying area wants to lodge an application with the Western Cape Liquor Authority, they would physically have to come into our offices to lodge that application. Or for example, where we were in a lockdown, in the lockdown period, many of the services that you would normally make use of, if it is not a virtual process or if it is not an online process, became very cumbersome, where you physically have to go physically into an office or into a government building to have to access those services. And when face-to-face contact became limited, that became very problematic. So various factors has now contributed to us now thinking, like I said, further and thinking a little bit out of the box and thinking of more user-friendly ways to make those services accessible. And also, I think you will hear the word citizen-centric becoming sort of like the buzzword in the Western Cape Liquor Authority now, and that is basically where we are going towards with this project and trying to enable more things on a virtual platform versus a manual platform, which I think a lot of us would also find very useful. So you won't necessarily need to leave the comfort of your home if you have a smartphone or a tablet or a laptop. You'd be able to access all of these services virtually and also in a physical format, but I'll speak a little bit more about that now. So our online client services platform basically consists of two legs. There will be a virtual leg, which is the online client services portal, as well as a physical facility, which will be our client services center. And that is to, as we said now, enable easy access to our services. So you have a choice. We still have the manual process, of course, because that is in our legislation. And then we also will have this online system. So the online system, which we are very excited about launching, is basically going to take the form of a user profile registration, where you will then be able to go into a profile where there are various applications. If you've lodged numerous applications or licenses, if you are a license holder and you have more than one license, and you'll be able to access all of that information on this platform. However, if you still would like to come into our offices and access our services in that manner, we will also have that facility available for you. And of course, we envisage that by creating this platform and streamlining our client services, we will significantly expand on our service delivery footprint within the Western Cape, which for us is very important because at the end of the day, we are here to serve the interests of the general public. So as I've mentioned now, the first leg of this process or of this project is the online client services portal, which would be a web-enabled portal. So this project that we're embarking upon in terms of this portal will entail the hosting of applicant and license holder information in relation to in relation to the services of the WCLA. So if you are wanting to apply for example, an event application for a Section 36, it would give you a drop-down list, and you'll be able to click on which application it is that you would like to lodge or apply for. And it will also make available to certain information to our applicants and to our license holders. For example, if you'd like to see what the renewal fee is going to be for a specific license, that information will pop up. And in terms of the portal, you would even be able to pay for that specific fee via a link. So there will be a payment module also linked to this. So not only will information be available on the portal for you to view, but it is also interactive, so you will be able to, by virtue of drop-downs, click on a certain category. You'll be able to see application information, license holder information, renewal information, information on inspections that has been held, and also if there are any fines linked, for example, to a license, you would be able to view that information there as well. And what we're also trying to do is to make it, like we said, user-friendly, so that if you need to make payments in respect of any outstanding amounts to the authority, you would obviously be able to do that via that portal as well. What we've encountered in the past is that we've had various problems with underpayments, overpayments. So short payments is okay, the overpayments is not necessarily the problem because then you've paid the full amount, but the short payments is quite a problem, which means that it might result in the license lapsing. So for that purpose, the exact amount that is payable to the authority would be available on the platform, and you can just click on that amount and then it will take you to a payment link where you will be able to settle that amount. And obviously this is a great value add, I think, for those who didn't necessarily have that information available to them or didn't know what the exact amount is that they need to pay for any specific one of the services that they've subscribed to. Also, the remote accessibility, like I said, you'll be able to view the application statuses and the license statuses, lodge applications remotely, etc. So this is but only a few of the services that will be offered. At the later stage, we will obviously expand, but for purposes of the pilot, we want to see those services being offered on that platform. Yeah, this is also part of our plan on finding new ways to engage effectively also with our citizens, because as we know, if a need arises, and we are not responsive to that need, it doesn't really mean that you're not really adding any value. So we want to see ourselves adding value in that regard by being responsive to the needs and creating these platforms that will actually serve to the best interests of our stakeholders. Then, like I said, the physical facility, you have the online facility, and now you will also have a physical facility. where citizens might, however, still prefer the option of hand-delivered applications. And as we know, this may comprise of several pages of documents, apart from the application form itself. So our customer service center would then be available to assist applicants with the process from lodgement to the final outcome. So it's an all-encompassing service. The service available via the virtual platform, which is the online client services portal, will also be available at the client services center. So it's basically just a division of the two. So you look at client services, you look at the virtual platform, being the online client services portal, which is a web-based portal, and it will be accessible via our website. And then you also look at the physical facility, which will be available at the offices of the Western Cape League Authority, and this will be via our client services center. So much like what you would experience, for example, when you visit any one of these client services centers where you can go in, you will have a self-service kiosk where you can either register your profile if you are a new registrant, or if you already have a profile, you'll be able to access all of your information by virtue of a simple login process. And the self-service kiosk will be able to house all that information at the touch of a button. We will also have client service agents who will be there to assist with providing documentation to applicants and also be able to process the documentation on their behalf at the stage of lodgement. Our timeframes. The timeframes in terms of this project is that we are looking at rolling out the first phase of that project in July this year. So we are working on various phases to this project. Phase 1 consists of our user profile registration, as well as our payment module and a capturing module as well. So what we would like to see in terms of this project is that all the information that is basically able to pull through from our back-end system, which is our LMAT system, can be viewed at the front end. This will obviously be view-only access because we still have our processing staff in our administration unit that is able to capture all of the information and update any information as and when it is received. As a registrant, you would not necessarily be able to manipulate or be able to edit that information, but you will be able to view it. The only thing that you would be able to insert is the information in terms of your user profile registration. So that means all information, and as far as possible, updated information is required of the registrant. Contact information as well, because it will be an interactive system, much like SARS, where you would get notifications basically as and when there is updates available in terms of the application as well as the license status. And like I said, it is envisaged that the first phase of this project will be complete by July this year. The follow-up phases will obviously be rolled out in the course of this financial year as well, but we will keep you all informed in terms of developments in that regard, as well as the rollout of the Client Services Center. In conclusion, basically what the WCLA is aiming to do with this process is to develop a lifelong relationship with our license holders. And it is envisaged that this will be achieved by means of a citizen-centric approach, is what we've said before, and also being responsive to the needs of the citizen. Because if you're not being responsive, then obviously it means that you're missing something along the way, and that is something that obviously we don't want to be doing. We want to know exactly what it is that is required out there by yourselves, also as the liquor consultants, as well as the license holders and the applicants, how we can address those expectations and meet those needs, and how we can do that in a way that is technically savvy, because as we know, we are living in an era now where, you know, every guy on the street has a smartphone, and, you know, everybody accesses all the information on some sort of a device, being a tablet, smartphone, whatever the case may be. So that means that, you know, we need to be moving with those times, and we need to start looking at how we make our services accessible also remotely, seeing as that is something that is becoming more prevalent now, and also to be suitably responsive and relatable, and creating a licensing platform that is able to address that. And also to, as the CEO has stated, to eliminate any complexities in our systems and in our processes, and enable us to be able to regulate in the best interest of the public, but doing it also in a manner that is taking all of the technological enhancements of our time into consideration. my story. Thank you very much, everyone. I know this is a mouthful, and I know this is a new concept for everyone, but I hope that I have amply addressed the topic, and I think there will probably be questions at the end, and I think we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Letitia, and apologies again for the disruption. I'm going to invite our CFO to join us now, Sandiso, and you do have the challenge of needing to fit into not more than 12 minutes, but I'm sure that it will be a challenge you can achieve.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that alarm is warning you that I'll appropriate to myself 8 more minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandiso. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the Western Cape Liquor Authority. My job is pretty much done to a great extent, so I'll be skipping all the context slides in terms of what the Western Cape does, because that's already covered. I think the one thing I need to maybe address is to say, when we say alcohol-related harms, what do we mean? But that we mean that 52% of the murders that occur in the Western Cape are linked to alcohol, and there's data to support that. And 42% of the traumas are linked to alcohol, and there's data to support that. And it's Western Cape specific data. Where I would want to start is, where are we as a Western Cape Liquor Authority from a regulatory perspective, specifically enforcement? When we did a situation analysis in November 2020, we found that there was an issue of adequate capacity with regards to enforcement that required urgent addressing. At that time, we had licensees up to 3,000 that went a period of 4 years not being inspected, which meant that even though those licenses were granted with conditions, we went a period of 4 years without confirming whether any of those conditions were being addressed. It then meant that the public, in terms of the regulatory relationship we have with them and the commitment we've made in terms of protecting public interest, was being shortchanged. The progress we've made in addressing that to date is to say we have added more enforcement capacity. At the time of that analysis, we had only 11 inspectors. To date, we've added 24 inspectors. 5 of those focus on addressing the backlog of inspections over the period, and the rest are just to focus on our risk-adjusted strategy and our visibility strategy. And when I speak of the capacity, you can track the trends in terms of that capacity in relation to other law enforcement agencies, which is SEPs, and other regulatory bodies across the world. In that, the ratio of a licensee to inspector back in 2016-17 at the approval of the white paper, it was 1 inspector was looking after 949 licensees. That was not sustainable from an impact point of view, when the recommended average is 1 is to 450. We then, with the additional enforcement capacity, have been able to bring our inspectorate capacity to within the international norms and the international average. And it is only then that we are then able to be the regulator that is able to protect public interest. If you look at the number of inspections we've been able to do over the years, that's the numbers. For the first time in the current financial year, and the data you're looking at the current financial year is up to January. For the first time, we're able to do inspections that cover the number of licensees we have. Therefore, it is then possible now to inspect every licensed premises a year. We follow a strategy of routine inspections to every licensee, as you would with an audit. Whether you've got a clean audit or not, you will be audited every year. And it's part of the regulatory mechanisms that or the regulatory space you've agreed to participate in. And where are we now in relation to that? In that we only have about 10% of our licenses not inspected over a period of 4 years, and we expect that to be addressed by the end of this financial year. And then that enables the possibilities that are then coming. And I think at the high level, I just need to address the issue of how are we resourced? Because if we're saying we've got capacity constraints and we're bringing about measures to address that capacity constraint, how are we resourced in terms of our resources? we have got two streams of funds. There are the funds we collect for ourselves, and there are the funds we collect and pay over to the Provincial Revenue Fund. We collect above 55.9 million, 77% of which is then paid over to the Provincial Revenue Fund, and the remainder is called own revenue. However, in that relationship, then the Provincial Revenue Fund then appropriates funds back to us. And if you look at what we collect and pay over to the Provincial Revenue Fund vis-a-vis what they then pay to us, you can see that the fiscus is subsidizing the authority. Therefore, we're not self-sustainable. And the gap that we have experienced over the last 5 years is about 4.1 million. You'd understand that the white paper said, if anyone wants to participate in the sale of liquor, that is a regulated space, and that those who opt to participate must then cover the cost of that regulation. But currently, the fiscus is covering part of that cost. So therefore, there's a need to introduce mechanisms to address that. And then there's been motivation in that in whatever we do to address that challenge, we must introduce an element of differentiation. In that, we must come up with a mechanism that ensures the self-sustainability of the Western Cape Liquor Authority, which is a problem that I've just outlined. And then the second issue is that it must also contribute to the reduction of alcohol-related harms. The easiest way to achieve self-sustainability is to look at those 11 inspectors, dismiss 3 of them, and don't appoint any more. And then you say, because I've reduced the cost, I'm self-sustainable. But the level of service you're providing is unsustainable in itself, and that's not the method of self-sustainability we seek to achieve. We seek to achieve a method of self-sustainability that allows the authority to provide an optimal level of service, determine the cost of that optimal level of service, and come up with a mechanism to recover those costs. So to the extent that we've got inefficiencies, we introduce instruments to remove those inefficiencies in our process. However, if we've got areas where we feel like the level of service needs to be elevated, we will do that elevation, determine that cost, and then come up with a mechanism too. I won't go into the principles of what differentiation is and market segmentation is. Those are economic principles that are addressed in literature and elsewhere in other jurisdictions. But just to give an example of what would be then the differentiation that we could possibly look at, and this is still going through a development process. You could differentiate based on turnover. The white paper says we must differentiate based on volume, and there's other issues you could look at when differentiating. What we've seen during the lockdown, that operating hours were key element of differentiation. And the other objective behind differentiation, as addressed on previous slides, is alcohol harms reduction. How do we differentiate in a way that we target harms? Therefore, if you look at operating hours, you say anyone operates after midnight, means that alcohol is available for longer, and that could potentially be harmful to society. And therefore, I'll differentiate in a manner that allows me to target certain licensees based on when the alcohol is available. And attached thereto, there would then be the societal issues. There's a roadmap we have with the board in terms of how we'll achieve this. It will ultimately follow the legislative amendment process, which allows for public participation in the process. I have outlined the background and the need for differentiation, and now I will outline the plans we have for the current financial year, in that even though in terms of the grand plan I've outlined of differentiated pricing model requires legislative amendments, there is instruments that are currently available within our current act, and we'll be now enacting those. One such instrument which we'll do, we're following a phased approach to the introduction of the differential pricing model, in that in the first phase we'll be looking at introducing Section 64 of our Act. Section 64 of our Act speaks about non-automatic renewals. This section allows us to follow a differentiated enforcement and administration process, wherein we single out licensees who meet a certain criteria, and I won't go through that, the slides will be available to you. And that by doing so, you allow yourself to differentiate between license holders based on their direct or indirect contribution to harms. And the CEO previously spoke about that. For example, an errand license holder would have to pay an application fee. Currently, the application fee for a permanent license is 2,100. Therefore, because the responsibility of the authority in relation to the two applications would be the same, it is envisaged that those two fees would be the same, whatever they are for the current financial year. And that After making that application and paying that fee, they have to convince the LLT to renew that license, considering the harms that that licensee would have been associated with in the previous year. And then if the Liquor License Tribunal then permits the renewal then they will have to pay the renewal fee. For the first time, you would see that the cost of renewal of an errand licensee versus a compliant licensee will be differentiated by process, which is the administration and enforcement, but also differentiated in terms of fees, that they will attract a higher fee than other licensees. To other people, these amounts seem minuscule. A renewal fee is 5,000 rand. There's certain sectors of the society that feel that is too low, there's certain sectors of the society that feel that is too high. I've already touched on, but the biggest deterrent is a real possibility that the LLT might evaluate the balance of probabilities of public interest and then decide that the renewal of the license is not serving public interest. And therefore, the CEO spoke about the risk to one's livelihood, and that would you continue to trade in a manner that poses a significant risk to your existence of your licensing. And then if I look then at these plans and what the 64 then entails, I just oppose it with an automatic renewal. Currently, we issue renewal notices by the 1st November, and that should you get the renewal notice and pay, the license is then valid until 31st December of the following year. And that even if we don't issue that renewal notice, a licensee is not absolved of their responsibility to then pay the renewal fee on time to ensure the validity of the license. That's the automated process in terms of Section 63 of our Act. Section 64 says, if a licensee has met the criterion of being disqualified to hold a license, declared unfit, failed to comply with a compliance notice, or has been subject of alleged failure to comply with conditions, a compliance notice or the Act, or has been subject of a complaint from a municipality, that an automatic renewal process is no longer available. Therefore, that license is incapable of being automatically renewed. There's no discretion to the authority. The Act says we simply may not automatically renew it. All we have to do as an administrator is to confirm whether the criterion has been met, and if it has, it's not us who determine, it's the behavior of the licensee that determines whether that criterion gets met or not. And once it is met, and automatic renewal is no longer an option. Therefore, those licensees are only capable of being renewed through a manual process. And if we were to choose to renew them automatically without any just grounds, then that renewal would then be invalid. Then, just in broad terms, I still have time. In broad terms, what does this then entail? It means that we must inform licensees by 31 July whether or not their license will be automatically renewed or not. So the obligation is to inform those that will not be automatically renewed. And therefore, if you don't get that notice, it means you're part of the automatic renewal. But if you do get that notice, it means that your license is incapable of automatic renewal. It looks at, so the CEO spoke about this, maybe let me just address it to say, we're looking at a granting of a license which considers on a balance of probability a public interest. And then we look at whether the ongoing existence of that license is still of public interest. And that examination is an annual examination. It looks at one's conduct from the period 1 July to 30 June, or whether any of their behavior has posed any significant harm to public interest to warrant being subjected to this process. Then the Liquor Licensing Tribunal would then evaluate the balance of probabilities to see whether such harm is not. So if you look at it, you might find that those that then get subjected to this process still end up being renewed, because you might look at it and say, if you look at the compliance notice that was not complied with, there was no significant risk to public interest, therefore, in this case, I'll grant the renewal. But there's a risk that there will be a 10% whereby when you look at what the allegations are, and you look at possible further evidence around public interest, that for that 10%, they'll end up not being renewed. And therefore, the existence of that licensee would cease no more from the date of the determination of the Liquor Licensing Tribunal. So we issued that notice by 31st July to inform the licensee that they will not be automatically renewed based on that criterion, and therefore they will need to make an application in the prescribed form, pay the fee by no later than 30 September. If the licensee fails to comply with the notice, then the license will lapse. So the licensee can just decide, I know I'm not entitled to a renewal, let me just abandon this business. I can't comply with the requirements of the regulator, I'll opt to do another business that is outside of liquor. It is available to a licensee. However, if a licensee then decides to meet or happens to miss that deadline of 30 September, files an application which is late, they will need to make sure that there's motivation for the circumstances for why it's late, and that application would need to be made before 31 December, and for late application, there's a penalty of 150% of the renewal fee. So therefore, we would be encouraging licensees not to follow the process of late applications to try and ensure that should they receive those notices by 31st July, that the application do get lodged by 30 September to avoid the penalty that kicks in. You would imagine that if you lodge that application by 1 October, that 150% cannot be waived. And I think we're familiar with those penalties, in that even if you lodge it and pay the fee, or you lodge and pay the fee and it reflects, or it's paid after midnight, you'll still be liable for that fee. Taking it further, as I try to reach my conclusion, taking it further then to say the license remains valid until the LLT has concluded its determination, to avoid a situation whereby the determination of that renewal exceeds the period up until 31 December, that in 1 July there's no uncertainty around the existence of the licensee. And that when the LLT considers that license application for renewal, it has the same duty and power. And I want to emphasize the duty. The duty of the LLT is to ensure that the existence of license is only when, on balance of probabilities, it is in the public interest. The onus is on the applicant to prove that on balance of probability, the continued existence of that license is in the public interest. And when the LLT is not convinced, then it means that the scale of public interest, the benefit of doubt goes to the public. I won't go into much detail about this to say, then if the LLT then grants that renewal, then you must pay the renewal fee, and that if the application is refused, then the license lapses either immediately or upon a date determined by the LLT. I've lost connectivity. Okay, there you go. As I conclude, with 2 minutes to go, the objective of this approach is to introduce licensees and other stakeholders, which you are one of them, to a segmentation of licensees based on direct or indirect contribution to alcohol-related harms. This differentiation is meant to contribute towards the reduction of those harms, as it rewards good behavior while ensuring consequence management for errant licensees. And that, as the CEO has previously confirmed, in what we do, we seek to eliminate complexities and introduce citizen-centric regulatory methodologies. We always feel citizens that feel they're shortchanged with the granting of a license. However, with Section 64, it had always envisaged that once the license is granted and the public feels that the granting thereof was not in the public interest, if they're able to prove that the operating of that license is not in the public interest, there's a mechanism for the public interest to find expression in the renewal of that license. And that we had to make priorities, because if we didn't make priorities, then we don't have priorities and authority. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.